Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 1st of September 2016. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. And joining me today via Skype is Mark Anderson from American Free Press. Welcome to the program, Mark.
Thank you. Good morning here in Texas.
How's the weather over there?
Too early to tell, but it's been plenty hot. Very beautiful time of year, actually.
Okay, well, let's get straight into it then. Got lots to cover today, and we're going to start off with Tim Cook and Apple and tax. According to Tim Cook, who of course is the CEO of Apple, all this EU tax business is what he's describing as total political crap. Now, I think this is a little bit disingenuous. It's mostly political crap, but not entirely, I think. Most of the mainstream coverage of this, for most of that, they discuss the implications. They talk about appeals against the ruling, which could take years to resolve. They say that if the European Commission wins in the end, that the decision will reset the balance of power on tax policy in Europe. They say that in the sense that while national governments will still be able to set their own tax rates, that the European Commission would have the final say on how national rules are implemented. And the mainstream media is saying that success for Apple and Ireland might take some of that pressure away, and it might give national governments some more leeway. But they describe EU-US relations as being strained. So I was wondering, is there any other policy area where EU-US relations are strained at the moment? And of course, there is one, and that's TTIP. And as we pointed out, that both Germany and France, we pointed this out a couple of days ago, at least on the face of it, claiming that TTIP is dead. Well, we'll come back to this in a second. As for the Apple corporation tax saga, of course, this has been dragging on for years, not just Apple. So here we've got the mail from 2012. Google do evil, they said. Furious ministers and MPs rage at web firms' devious and unethical ways of avoiding tax in Britain. And also from 2012, tax rage at Apple and Amazon. So this has been going on for a very long time. Let's just remember that in May 2013, David Cameron wrote to all the leaders, to leaders of British offshore tax havens, saying that they needed to get their houses in order. And this was just prior to the G8 summit in 2013, also just prior to the Bilderberg conference in 2013. And Cameron said in this letter, as you know, I've made fighting the scourge of tax evasion and aggressive tax avoidance a priority for the G8 summit, which the UK is hosting next month. Remember, this is 2013. Cameron went on to say, I'm looking into all the overseas territories and crown dependencies to continue to work in partnership with the UK in taking the lead on two critical issues, tax information exchange and beneficial ownership. And the letter was sent to the leaders of Bermuda, the British Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, Gibraltar, Anguilla, Montserrat, Turks and Caicos Islands, Jersey, Guernsey, and the Isle of Man. This, of course, subsequently, a couple of years later, led to the Panama Papers revelations. And the Panama Papers were supposed to be a surprise to everybody. No, in fact, this was all planned, and Cameron had been working on this for years. This goes for the corporation tax thing as well. Cameron's 2013 letter went on to argue that a key part of the new tax regime would be information exchange. He was asking, in quotes, the tax havens to commit to the Multilateral Convention on Mutual Administrative Assistance in Tax Measures, originally developed by the OECD, which is the Council of Europe and the OECD, in fact. And this was to respond to the call of the G20 to make it easier for all countries to secure the benefits of the new cooperative tax environment. Now, also in May 2013, The Independent published this article on Google calling for a globalized tax regime, a global profit tax, as they were describing it. They were saying that this article was written by Ben Chu, who is their economics editor, and we were saying in 2013 that this was what was likely to be on the agenda for the Bilderberg conference. And they say the cascade of revelations in recent months showing multinational corporations doing a huge amount of business here and yet paying virtually no corporation tax has provoked widespread public demands for something to be done. national governments could and should try to put a stop to this egregious profit shifting on their own, but a unilateral approach is plainly second best. The natural solution is to secure an agreement by all the world's governments to tax the profits of multinational firms collectively and to divide up the revenues fairly between them. This division could be based on the amount of business done by the multinational in their various territories, as revealed by their turnover and number of employees. So this discussion has been going on for quite some time. And then last year, world leaders, according to this, world leaders must step up their efforts to fix the outdated system of taxing global profits. And this is the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation. And it's a group of leaders from around the world who believe that at this moment in history, there is both an urgent need and an unprecedented opportunity to bring about significant reform of the international corporate taxation system. The Commission aims to promote the reform debate through a wider and more inclusive discussion of international tax rules than is possible through any other existing forum. It's chaired by various people, including Joe Stiglitz, who's an advisor to the Corbyn leadership at the moment. They held their first meeting on the 18th to 19th of March 2015. It had what they described as expert presentations from various stakeholders in business, academic, labour, investment, governmental, and civil society sectors. So what we're saying here is, once again, this participatory democracy where only certain stakeholders get to participate. And who was driving this particular organisation? Well, is the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, absolutely a globalist foundation, and German think tank, of course. So I believe this is all about a global tax system, but increasingly it looks like it fits in with the ongoing spat over trade deals. So my assessment of this is that they're going for the big deal. Trade and tax and an uber collaboration, if you like, between huge corporate interests and increasingly corporatized national governments. So I think this is probably something pretty unpleasant coming. So let's move on to this, because here's another indication of it. TTIP and ISDS at the center of the argument. So what we have is the investor-state dispute settlement highlighted by this report from Global Justice Now. And they're saying that big business could sue governments over tax on profits. And they're saying that ISDS threatens tax justice in a number of ways. They're saying under the current system, states can and have been sued for changing tax laws, revoking tax breaks, and increasing corporate income and other tax. So, Mark, that's how I see it. I see this as being part and parcel of the whole argument over TTIP. TTIP stalled on one hand, and this global corporation tax hassle going on for years, never actually seeming to make any political progress over the last 4 or 5 years. And we get to the point where we've got both corporations and governments at each other's throats. Do you think I'm right?
I think you're very close, if not spot on, Mike. Hopefully I'm coming through well. I have some new infrastructure of my own here for communication on Skype. It's very interesting. From the big picture standpoint, this is similar to the American system around the year 1907, when there was the Great Panic of 1907. And what that did was create this whole atmosphere of the public wanting justice, demanding justice, because the economy was going through these gyrations and these steep uphills and downhills. And so they got this idea in the press that we had to have a central bank. We had to have a new monetary infrastructure. The wildcat banks were running wild. All sorts of economic indicators were indicating chaos. Out of chaos came order, and that gave us the Federal Reserve System. So I see a similar psychology going on here, where they want to whip up the public and use these corporations like Google and Apple as sort of the whipping boys, maybe fake whipping boys, but whipping boys nevertheless, and create this idea that we've got to do something. The experts have got this in hand. We've got Joseph Stiglitz, the American economist there. He must know. He must be a smart guy. And so they get everybody calling for blood and calling for justice, and they create this fake consent, this notion that the public is going to demand that we do something about these tax evaders, and they dangle it out there and they create this false consent. This is an age-old tactic, and from the big picture standpoint, that's what I see happening.
Absolutely, so we wait with interest to see how it all pans out. But I think at the end of the day, we're going to see corporation tax rules and infrastructure rolled into the international trade deals. Let's see how that goes. Okay, let's move on to Brexit. Now, yesterday, Theresa May held her first Brexit cabinet committee meeting at Chequers, which of course is her countryside retreat, and she gave a press conference afterwards where she said that Brexit means Brexit, and she's going to make a success of it. Now, frankly, if you heard her speech, it was pretty pathetic. The way she was presenting herself was so insipid that it was clear she didn't actually believe a word of what she was saying. Aside from that, of course, Brexit still hasn't been defined, so we don't actually know what Brexit actually means. So it isn't surprising, perhaps, that we continue to be bombarded with headlines like this. In the Independent here, UK will never leave EU because Brexit process is too complex, says academic. We're just seeing lots of this type of headline in the papers at the moment. So, well, you or I might know what Brexit means, but Theresa and her colleagues are at a loss. I don't think it's because they don't know what needs to be done. It's pretty clear what needs to be done. But I think it's because so much of the globalist policy agenda, trade deals, tax, military integration, and so on, isn't far enough along for her to progress. So we're in a holding pattern. We wait to see what everyone else will do to catch up. And in the meantime, the financial system, of course, is about to collapse under its own weight. But not only do we get these types of headlines about the Brexit process being too complex, but we get the likes of this from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. People pushed to the margins, driven to vote for Brexit. And this again is reinforcing the notion that it was really only the poor and the stupid who voted for Brexit, because Joseph Rowntree Foundation here is saying that it was people earning less than £20,000 a year with lower qualifications and living in low-skilled areas that were the driving force between the vote to leave the European Union. This, they said, was a double whammy of low skills and lack of opportunity. That low earners, low skilled workers, and left behind places drove the Leave vote, and that the government must deliver a Britain to work for all to heal the divisions. So that's probably why Theresa is now pushing her other initiative, because she also yesterday chaired the Social Reform Cabinet Committee, which is going to make Britain better for everyone, apparently not just the privileged few. And she said, at the same time as helping the most vulnerable, we must pursue social reform in a much broader sense to help make life easier for the majority of people in this country who just about manage. And she went on to say, you might have a job, but you don't always have job security. You might have your own home, but you worry about paying a mortgage. You can just about manage, but you worry about the cost of living and getting your kids into a good school. So while we continue to help the worst off, we'll also be focused on the millions of people for whom life is a struggle and who work all hours to keep their heads above water. Well, this is, of course, what does she mean by social reforms? What are the social reforms that she's going to attempt to pursue? And Mark, it is just staggering to me how many of the current policy agendas are being pushed through under the umbrella of Brexit, because Brexit has changed everything. While in the meantime, Brexit has actually changed nothing.
Once again, Mike, as we talked about a minute ago with the tax thing, there's psychology involved here, a kind of behaviorism that's being taught to the public. The Brexit passage on June 23rd is encouraging, and it's a good thing in a sense, but if nothing ever happens with it, while at the same time people think it was a big victory, that creates this chasm by which the establishment can pass all these other reforms in the way that you're saying. A false sense of accomplishment, a false sense of security for those Brexiters that approve that so-called exit. But unless they activate Article 50 and go through the process in the Lisbon Treaty by which any EU member can supposedly leave the EU, unless they do that, Britain remains a member of the EU, lock, stock, and barrel, 100%, and nothing has changed. This is something that we've got to keep square in the public mind.
Absolutely, and just that what you say is absolutely correct. But of course, Article 50 is one mechanism for leaving. There are others, including revoking the 1972 Act, which brought us in the first place. But
there you go. Yes.
Right. So there are other opportunities. But of course, there's so many vested interests involved in this, and there's so much fighting. And this is absolutely what we said was going to happen back in January, February, when we started talking about this this subject. We said that if the vote was to leave, which we believed it was, this was going to start a period of huge faction fighting and discussion for potentially years about how we actually leave, what Brexit actually represents, what does it actually mean, what kind of negotiations do we need to have, what kind of treaties do we need to have afterwards. It's exactly what was obvious to us at the time, and there's no end in sight for this. Theresa May saying Brexit means Brexit, but of course Brexit doesn't mean Brexit until after the end of the year at the earliest. They've put 3 people in charge of this process that are at each other's throats within the cabinet. So it's impossible to see how there can be any progress on this in the near term.
I would add about the TTIP thing. This is important. This covers both our tax discussion, a few minutes ago, and Brexit now. TTIP and the TPP, these trade deals, people need to understand these are a completely new socio-economic infrastructure of the world government. They're a governing system unto themselves, complete with these investor dispute private tribunals, these private courts. And when you have TTIP, you have a different infrastructure into which Britain will be inserted along with the EU and the United States. And as I put on my blog, thetruthhound.com recently, that that they've been talking about since before Bilderberg. And even if Brexit were to happen on paper, once Britain joins the transatlantic community full bore through TTIP, that'll be even more embedded than you were just being a member of the EU. You'll be even more embedded as this Atlanticist member. Right. It's a larger infrastructure, and plus the passage of TTIP, even though it's stalled now, would help cement a global tax because they'll just put the global tax within the machinery of TTIP.
Absolutely, absolutely. And let's not forget the third leg to the stool. We've got to keep the acronym TISA in everybody's mind as well.
Yes.
Which is the Trade and Services Agreement. So we've got to keep all 3 of these trade agreements right at the forefront of people's minds. Okay, let's move on, Mark, to United States politics and obviously the presidential election. And you have an article here on your blog. After packed Austin rally, Trump staffers admit electronic election theft is a threat.
Yes, on my last show we had connection problems, so I couldn't get into this. This was August 23rd, and I covered a Trump rally, a very big one in Austin, Texas. And sometimes I'm a bit of an activist, or let's just say a pamphleteer. And I managed to get to Trump's rally manager, a national rally manager, and share with him a previous American Free Press article about the concerns of Ohio activist Jim Condit Jr. about the consortium and the electronic voting machines that helps ensure that elections can be stolen and have been stolen in the United States. And so I got this information through to Trump's people. It took some doing, but a man speaking on condition of anonymity who helps arrange Trump's rallies throughout the country said that when Trump speaks of the system being rigged, he is including electronic voting fraud. That's partially and mainly what he means. He is also talking about party shenanigans at the national party level, and he's also talking about all the misleading polling that's going on, some of which has its roots in the Tavistock Institute in England, all the way that polls can be used to manipulate public opinion, not merely survey public opinion. At any rate, this is what Trump's talking about. I got through to his people. They're acknowledging electronic voting fraud. This is a big thing because this is something that needs to be known throughout the United States and throughout the world, precisely how elections can and have been stolen.
And so who are the election night gatekeepers then?
Well, they're the big media outlets. What I see on my screen here that you're showing is not very large. Okay, here we go. The main ones, according to Jim Condit Jr. of Ohio, who spent a lot of time with the vote fraud pioneers, the Collier brothers, they wrote the book Vote Scam, are ES&S, one of the voting machine companies, that's Election Systems and Software in Omaha, Nebraska, Hart InterCivic, a voting machine company based in Austin, Texas, Dominion Voting. I don't recall right offhand where Dominion's located, but those are the three machine manufacturers, ES&S in Omaha, Hart InterCivic, Austin, and Dominion. Then you've got the media networks, CBS, NBC, ABC, Associated Press, CNN, and Fox, the two dominant political parties, Republican and Democratic, and lastly, the most important one, the National Election Pool, jointly owned by ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, Fox, and AP Wire. And the National Election Pool is this consortium by the media that receives all the vote tallies from the electronic voting machines via the counties and the intermediate governments in the U.S. and pulls the election results together, National Election Pool, as the name indicates, and then the media outlets can only report the results as they're processed through the National Election Pool, which is connected to the voting machine companies. And so this collectively, everything I'm describing is the election night gatekeepers. And it's very important. Jim Condit Jr. would tell you that they had a big effect in marginalizing Pat Buchanan's run. He's a paleocon, an anti-war conservative who ran 20 years ago in 1996. I would heartily recommend, perhaps if you can, Mike, having Jim Condit Jr. on this show or on Insight to get into this even more. But this is what I sought to inform the Trump campaign about. This is what they acknowledged as knowing about. American Free Press and me as an individual believe it's much more important to know how the election machinery works and not get so much into the mudslinging of parties, not get into the partisanship so much. We need to be more neutral in those things. It's not so much about who, even though that's important, but it's more about how and what. And this is why I'm stressing this.
Okay, so is there any independent audit of the voting machines? And in fact, I wonder how that independent audit could be done.
Well, one of the problems with electronic voting machines, and I've used them myself, is when you vote, when you press, let's say, a touch screen by Hart InterCivic made in Austin, once that vote and you hit send and it takes your votes that you put on the touch screen, they go into this netherworld. The election officials cannot retrieve your vote. There's no ballot with a number on it related to my name in the logbook that says Mark Anderson voted on ballot number 123, and here's ballot number 123, and here's how Mark voted. Unlike a paper ballot where they could actually trace and find my actual ballot and say, okay, we got the right ballot associated with your name, Mark, and we can retrieve how you voted. Not so with the Hart InterCivic, for example. Once it goes into the netherworld, it cannot be retrieved. The only way is to have a paper ballot counted at the precinct level, not counted at central tabulation. So each precinct has its own count where each individual's ballot can be retrieved. The people I've talked to say this is really the only way to ensure that you would have a retrievable and verifiable vote count.
Well, of course, thankfully in the UK, we do not have electronic voting of this type at this point in time. Although there does seem to be plenty of scope, there does seem to have been some evidence suggesting at least that there's plenty of scope for electoral fraud over here, and that's generally through the postal vote. And the postal vote has increased almost exponentially over the last few years. A lot of people are very suspicious of that. And of course, one or two private corporations, IDOX, which is spelled IDOX, is one company which is often highlighted as being one that is employed to manage voting in this country, and particularly the postal vote. And it has been pointed out that IDOX has at least one serving MP on its on its board of governors as a non-executive director. So, non-executive director or not, there seems to be a massive conflict of interest there, or at least a potential one. Okay, so we'll move on. Let's go to economy, and we've been talking about on this program over the last year or so the situation with shipping and how shipping is in a state of collapse, which reflects the economic situation generally, of course. And this is Hanjin Shipping Company. They are South Korea's largest sea container shipping firm, seventh biggest in the world, and they've basically gone bust. So they filed for equivalent of Chapter 11 protection, court protection, because they're going out of business, and this is resulting in they've got ships stuck in mid-ocean at the moment because ports won't permit their ships to land. The ports are worried that port fees and other fees won't be paid, and so they're not letting the container ships land. 3 of Hanjin's vessels are currently stuck off the west coast of United States. There's one stranded in British Columbia, off the coast of British Columbia. There's some of them not allowed into the Korean port of Busan because the company hasn't paid dues there. And another seized at Singapore. 10 more impounded at Chinese ports. So things not going terribly well for this organization, but it is representative of what's going on in the world economy, the real economy. But we don't need to worry, do we? Because as we mentioned on Friday, the central banks have been meeting in the United States to discuss setting up a resilient monetary policy framework for the future. But Mark, has anything actually come out of this meeting?
Other than legerdemain and confusing language that only central bankers totally understand, other than that, not really. The Jackson Hole, Wyoming meeting is an annual meeting, as you know, Mike, of central bankers from Europe and other nations. Japan was there this year, late August, as well, of course, the head of the Federal Reserve, Janet Yellen, your friend and mine. It's a lot of the same legalese and bankerese and globalese that these guys often speak about, half-hearted structural reforms. What they're basically saying in this article that I sent you from Reuters is that they've hit a wall. They don't know what to do. And what I shared with you earlier, Mike, was some writing by an author, Oliver Haydorn, who wrote a book, Social Credit Economics. And one thing very interesting about this is that what Oliver has identified, and this goes back to C.H. Douglas, the conceiver of social credit in the British Isles in the early 1900s, a little less than 100 years ago. And social credit spread throughout the Dominions, Australia, New Zealand, and it was discussed by groups and clubs. But the core flaw, there's this ongoing corrosive flaw in the economic system, this defect, and it needs to be fixed. If it's not fixed, it has a terrible effect and leads the world to all sorts of economic arrangements that create economic tension, trade wars, and even military war, historically and currently. But what Oliver wrote on the Distributist, which is a website that talks about different angles on economics and thinks outside the box, and what Oliver wrote was, a self-liquidating financial system, if we had one, would always maintain price values and consumer incomes in an automatic balance, such that the act of producing a specified volume of goods and services would always distribute sufficient purchasing power to liquidate or cancel once and for all those price values out there and all the goods and services. The present system, and this is the key flaw, is not self-liquidating, precisely because it generates prices at a faster and greater rate than it distributes the consumer income, with which those prices might be met. So this is one reason we have high prices. The system produces the price structure and the price values faster and in greater amounts than consumer income can be generated through wages and salaries. And this central flaw is something that the bankers, in my opinion, are hiding. And if this corrosive flaw is not fixed, then all economies throughout the world are always going to suffer from the fact that this is neglected.
Well, the question in my mind remains whether this situation is being weaponized and being used to threaten. We did highlight this last week as well, which was the European Central Bank basically telling European nations that if they don't implement what the ECB was describing as adequate Eurozone reforms, then the ECB would force the government's hands by basically implementing more extreme monetary policy than they already are. But we should also just highlight this article from Zero Hedge, because Deutsche Bank, of course, probably the most bankrupt of any of the European banks, has calculated how much stock market value, in inverted commas, because it's not really value at all, has been created by the action of central banks, and they took the S&P as the example of this. And what Deutsche Bank has said is that they believe that the S&P is being inflated by 40% as a result of central bank action. So if central banks therefore become massively powerful, in the sense that if they were to remove that support, and potentially you would see a 40% reduction in the quotes value of the S&P and other stock markets. They're basically holding the world to ransom. This isn't anything that we don't already know. But one of the other things that seems to have come out of this Jackson Hole meeting is that it's increasingly apparent that central banks are coordinating their action around the world. And of course, a word or a phrase or a name which is rarely, if ever, mentioned in the mainstream press is the Bank for International Settlements. And this is the central bank of central banks. Certainly the coverage of this latest Jackson Hole meeting, confab, doesn't really seem to mention the Bank for International Settlements at all. And so the question then has to be, are the central banks coordinating policy around the world? Well, of course they are, but that in itself isn't legal, is it?
Well, certainly it's not constitutional in the traditional American sense. I don't know exactly how that would work constitutionally speaking in Britain or the Dominions and so on and so forth. When the Federal Reserve was created, many congressmen, including Charles Lindbergh Sr., the father of the famed aviator, spoke of the now we have a money trust that will override the will of the people and override the sovereign government itself. We've created the largest trust on earth, he said, apart from all the other trusts that had a lot of power in the early 20th century. So Mr. Lindbergh was a leading voice in Congress against the Federal Reserve Act, also known as the Aldrich Bill, and he saw this huge trust coming. And now what you're talking about, Mike, is it's become a world trust, the Bank for International Settlements out of Switzerland being probably the nucleus of this atom, and the central bank of the central banks. And now they have this world trust, and the Jackson Hole meeting, as you say, is where they compare notes and they coordinate, and they do hold the world ransom through the stock support you mentioned, by hiding the flaw, the financial system, the core flaw that I mentioned a few minutes ago from the social credit author Oliver Haydorn and others that have pointed to that. And this is what they do. They're part of the parallel shadow government along with this trade structure that they're trying to enhance through TTIP and TPP. It's their own infrastructure that is completely undemocratic in nature and privatizes the vote through electronic voting machines. Therefore, voting is privatized. The monetary system is privatized. Everything is based on a corporate government collusion, collaboration, and privatization. It all becomes very apparent that they want all the different parts of the machine working along the same lines. And the Jackson Hole thing is a lot of the same confusing legerdemain and ambiguous so-called problems and solutions that they always talk about. The average person has trouble reading the tea leaves and understanding exactly what they're saying.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, well, let's move on to a related issue then, which of course is mortgages, because this is the other way that we're held to ransom through credit and mortgages. And this article here from Business Insider saying Britain's latest rise in property prices is just the calm before the storm. They're saying house prices in the UK grew by 5.6% on an annual basis in August, suggesting that Brexit is yet to have any real effect on the British housing market. They go on to say the rise, however, looks pretty likely to be a small blip in an upcoming downturn in Britain's property market, triggered by the economic uncertainty surrounding when and how the UK exits the EU. As I said, everything is being blamed on Brexit, but perhaps this has something to do with it as well, because RT pointing out that UK mortgage approvals have dropped to an 18-month low, so credit being withheld. The data shows that 60,912 new mortgages were approved in the first full month after the Brexit vote, a 3,000 decline from the month earlier, and the lowest total since January 2015. So what we've got here is, well, before we mention what we've got, we'll just highlight this BBC article here, which of course is saying that perhaps the so-called Bank of Mum and Dad might make up the shortfall, because what the BBC is pushing here is not only the notion that the Bank of Mum and Dad lends to their own children in order to get them on the housing market, because unless they're on the housing market, they can't be good little slaves. We've got to have the Bank of Mum and Dad lending to other people's children as well, if perhaps their parents can't afford or don't have quite as much funds in the bank. So this is the kind of scenario that we've got. But actually, the main driver for UK house prices at the moment has been foreign investment. So perhaps this is one area where Brexit has had an effect, because perhaps there is a little bit of holding back by foreign investors in the British property market while they wait to see what's going on. Mark, what's going on with mortgages in the States? Has there been a resurgence of subprime lending in the United States? And I know certainly in the automotive market there has been, but what about the housing market? Is that still suffering from 2008?
Not as much. I don't have a handle on all of it. I do know that it's taken a bit of an upswing, even though the Federal Reserve has announced that it's going to raise interest rates. That moves like molasses, and rates are still low. There's programs for the poorer people from the government, the TARP program, I believe it's called, that enable them to get better conditions, better terms for first-time home buying. So first-time home buying is going somewhat well. And then there's still a lot of refinancing where people use their house as an ATM to get money, because the economy is so sorely lacking in purchasing power compared to the price structure and compared to all the debts, public and private, at all levels. At any rate, it's going reasonably well, with interest rates still low, with up the ladder programs for those with lesser incomes. It's not stellar, but it's not in park either. It's moving along a little bit, but a lot of houses are still way overpriced, and there's not much of a manufacturing economy here, except in a couple different sectors where there's been something of a resurgence. But people are still surviving on a lot of personal debt and having to take out large mortgages, and that creates risks. But overall, there's a bit of an uptick.
Now in the chat box, it's scrolled off the bottom, so I can't remember who it was said this. Somebody was saying that banks aren't lending money at the moment because they can't make money at 0% interest rates, and therefore they've stopped lending. I don't think that's quite what's going on, because of course mortgage rates are still around the 3, 4, 5%, depending on what type of mortgage you've got. So mortgage rates aren't falling just as quite as to the level that interbank lending and so on is falling. And of course, with negative interest rates thereabouts, it's costing banks money to hold money in accounts with the central banks. So in fact, that should be an incentive to cause them to lend money. I think the main thing that is causing them not to lend money is the fact that they don't actually have any to lend at the moment.
Well, I would add that they're a lot stricter in the states on credit ratings. All it takes is a couple flaws on your credit record, and you can be denied a loan, whereas otherwise everything else might be fine on your personal economic record. One or two mistakes, and you're being denied a loan, or you're given loans with higher interest rates to reflect the risk. So there's a lot of nitpicking going on, and there is a withholding of credit in some respects along some avenues. That's true.
Yes. Okay. Well, let's finish off with this one then. A piece of good news, because in Australia has suffered badly, particularly in the eastern part of the country, with fracking. Well, this is a piece of news that the Victorian government has announced a permanent ban on the exploration and development of all onshore unconventional gas in Victoria, including fracking and coal seam gas. And they're doing that basically to protect the farming industry. That's got to be seen as a positive step. Well, the main reason I just wanted to mention this is to say that Ian Crane, of course, has been on a bit of a hiatus for the last few weeks. He will be back, not this coming Monday, but the Monday following, which is Monday the 12th of September. So I'm looking forward to that and getting an update on what's been going on in that area. So, Mark, I think that's us for today. Thank you very much for joining us. Have you got any closing comments?
Yeah, just to add a clarifier on what I was talking about on Haydorn's book, this economic flaw that we have when we have prices overtaking income by such a large degree, what the social creditors have called for is the need for a universal dividend, where some percentage of people's income could come not through the labor system, not through the labor market, but through a interest-free issuance of newly minted money, where everyone would receive an allowance to supplement their income, and that would fix this flaw. As they say in England, mind the gap. This would be a way of minding the gap, and this is the thing the bankers don't want to talk about, is that we can democratize the economy, have a democratic system, unprivatize it, if you will, get rid of this privatization of the issuance of money, and fix this flaw. This is not an ideology or a utopianism I'm talking about. I'm talking about fixing a known flaw, and this is covered up because the bankers don't want an economic democracy. They want to keep their economic dictatorship that tends to run the rest of the world. And I just need to clarify that so what I said earlier isn't incomplete. So okay, there we go.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Mark. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for everybody for joining us today. We will be back at the same time tomorrow, 1 p.m. as usual. We'll have David Scott with us tomorrow, and we'll see you then. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.